baby.
Son of a...
And I've talked a lot about that 70s show here on the channel, as it's one of my all-time favorite shows. So when an official sequel was announced, I was more than a little bit invested. A return of the characters I knew and loved set in the decade that I originally watched the characters I knew and loved? Yeah, sign me up. And now that the past is finally here, join me in the present as we take a look back into the past that's presently taking place.
What? What does that even mean?
I'd like to start with a blast from the past, by catching up with all our favorite 70s characters in the 90s. First and foremost, I love the way the show uses and utilizes the previous show's leading and reoccurring characters. Their inclusions for the most part don't really feel forced, and they only occur when it could benefit the current narrative. It's fan service for the betterment of the plot. I really like this because it creates an atmosphere of anything could happen for the returning audience. And for potential brand new audiences, the show makes them understand the older characters while still justifying their place in the follow-up. Most of them aren't on the main cast, so they're not really relied on the way they once were, but they are still familiar elements that linger on. They're still vital, but they're not on the pulse of this new series. I have to applaud the series for this, because it would be very easy for these walk-on walks down memory lane to feel distracting from the plot at hand, but instead they're integrated into it. The way the original players are used in the series gives the new characters enough space and room to grow. This still allows the old Point Place gang to make major contributions to the new show. So for me personally, I think it's just the right amount of use of these characters. And I'd be all for them continuing the cameos, Easter eggs, and guest star spots so long as they continue to do it in a meaningful manner. Those returns are mostly pretty great, but as usual, I have some reservations. Immediately right off the bat after watching the first episode, I felt a little bit let down. I was really hoping that this show would be a return to form, seeing the characters we know and love come back, albeit with a couple more gray hairs and wrinkles. I know it'd be pretty improbable to expect them to recapture 1998, but I was hoping for something a little bit better than 2005. What I mean by this is, there comes a point in time in the show where some of the characters began to feel victims of Flanderization, Eric Foreman most notably. Instead of being written to be a three-dimensional character who had all different types of traits, quirks, interests, and whatever else, suddenly he was just written as a nerd. And that's all there was to him. The character that once felt like a person suddenly began feeling like a one-note joke. And this new show really hammers that home, almost immediately. And then it doubles down in the following scene. It makes Eric seem kinda pathetic. I also didn't like that he was brought back and put in the same exact clothing he'd worn 20 years ago. And I'm also not a fan that he hasn't gotten a haircut in the last 2 decades. It's kinda off-putting, because most people don't dress the same at 38 as they did when they were 18. Maybe this was done for the benefit of the viewers. They wanted to remind us of the character we loved, but everyone else has a modern makeover that works well for them. Donna, Jackie, Kelso, Fez, they all still look just like their characters, but they look like the characters at later stages of life. So why is Eric Foreman frozen in 1976? Outside of this, he does feel like the same character, if not somewhat more exaggerated. His struggles of trying to relate to his child feel very real. And in just one appearance on the show thus far, he acted as the pilot plot's emotional core, making his one moment on the show meaningful. Donna doesn't have a whole lot to do in the first episode. She's just sort of there to support her daughter and comfort her husband, which kind of makes her feel like the glue that holds the whole family dynamic together. Outside of that, she's also said to be a relatively successful writer and is without a doubt the more down-to-earth parent, which should be a surprise to no one as everyone knows Eric's out in space. I think all of this is very on brand for the character. Donna's not really given a whole lot of time to shine here, but she is at least given a dignified comeback, and she does make appearances in following episodes. Eric and Donna's relationship, while still showing Eric being a little selfish or oblivious to certain things, does feel a lot stronger than it did in the final seasons of the show. It's actually pretty endearing to watch these two get back together as adults. It's sweet seeing them having made it out on the other side of the chaos that was the 70s. Watching them reenact their flirty behavior from the first episode was a really nice touch. And if nothing else, seeing where and how they ended up, it makes the series finale with the two reuniting feel more worth it. I think this pilot retroactively makes that last episode of the show seem somewhat more justified. I also like seeing the hindsight hypocrisy that Eric and Donna kinda lose it on their daughter for hanging out on the top of the water tower, the exact same spot where they spent most of their days growing up. While it does show growth from Eric and Donna, it also highlights a certain do as I say, not as I do philosophy that I think a lot of parents have. Regardless, they don't want their daughter taking the same risks that they did. Nor should they, because those risks had consequences for some people. I have mixed feelings about Donna and Kitty passive-aggressively butting heads, because that was definitely something that's happened before, sure, but that was one of the less fondly remembered arcs, and one that seemingly came to a close with the series finale, as the two shared a tear and a hug. All of that seems to be undone a little bit now, so I guess I take back what I just said about the justified part. But again, I guess fighting between in-laws is certainly not unheard of. I mean, it's actually a pretty common trope. I really like the idea of Red and Kitty helping Eric and Donna raise a teenager. It's kind of a sweet passing of the torch premise. And I think a part of me is gonna wish that the rest of the show was like this. Eric and Donna still seem like new parents, but that's because almost every year is a completely different experience with a child. And while they've mastered at raising an infant and, I don't know, whatever those little mutants evolve into next, a teenager is a whole different ballpark of rebellion and teenage angst, whereas Mr. and Mrs. Foreman are now veterans in said endeavor. The return of Red and Kitty Foreman as main characters is a very inspired choice. Both Kirkwood Smith and Deborah Jo Rupp bought their A-game, seamlessly slipping back into the roles they haven't played in years. They feel like the same old Red and Kitty, just with more life experience. I loved seeing their transition from parents into grandparents, and how similar but distinctly different those two experiences are. They are without a doubt the highlight of the show thus far for me, as they seem to approach their roles with the same enthusiasm and chops that they did in the actual 90s. They are actually perfect, and they alone are worth checking the show out for. I really love the absolute joy Red has when watching his son try to reprimand his daughter. I think that's very on brand for Red, but also very on brand for grandparents. I mean, my whole life, my father's told me, I hope you have one just like you, because I'm going to teach him all of your old tricks so he can do to you what you've done to me. So I think that a lot of parents who watch their own children become parents hope for a very similar thing. Initially, Kitty is so desperate for attention from the outside world that she guilt-trips her son shortly after his arrival, and then practically begs Red to open up their home to their granddaughter. And while Red is pretty reluctant on all the extra company, he still becomes fond of the 90s teens and shows compassion in silent gestures. It's a really sweet and sincere development that feels legitimate. Red has always been compassionate. Maybe not necessarily with his words per se, but with his actions. Because this isn't the only time he's opened up his home for somebody. Case in point, he scolds Nate for asking him for one of his flannels, only to later on place one on his car for him. It's kinda nice watching these two become intertwined not only in their granddaughter's life, but their granddaughter's group of friends' lives. Kitty sort of becomes a secondary mother figure to all these characters. And there's actually a pretty touching moment this season when Oz comes out to Kitty, who without fully understanding the weight of the moment, accepts him in passing before moving on. And then when she realizes how important this moment is to Oz, she nearly comes to tears with how honored she feels. I think overall, the Foremans seem to be a little bit more involved in this series than they were in the original, which is not a complaint. I buy into all the family dynamics on the show. The entertainment that Red gets out of seeing his son go through what he went through, watching the Foremans come together and make decisions as a family, I actually think these moments were the strongest parts of the first episode. But outside of the Foreman household, they did justice to a lot of the returning recurring characters. I have to applaud the way they handled Jackie. Toward the end of that 70s show, the creative vision shifted, and with it, so did Jackie's direction. While she was initially in an on-again, off-again relationship with Kelso, they'd seemingly end permanently when Jackie began dating Hyde. I don't want to go over this too much, but I think this particular couple led to a lot of growth in Jackie's character, and she kinda went through her own mini redemption arc that saw her become less of a caricature and more of a character. It was like a de-Flanderization, but unfortunately plans for the character changed, and the new showrunners decided to have the two broken up to tease a possible rekindling romance with Kelso, who would propose to her. She'd turn him down, only for her to somehow end up with Fez. In the same season that saw her try to make things work with Steven at the beginning, get proposed to by Michael shortly thereafter, she somehow ended up with Fez. I'm glad this series decided to move on from that mistake and have her get back with Kelso. While ideally I think Jackie would have ended up with Hyde, that really isn't a possibility here given obvious outside forces. So I think Kelso is almost an equally good choice, as the two have a long-standing history and even flirted with the idea of getting back together before Kelso moved to Chicago. For everything the show set up, them coming back together makes about as much sense as anything else. I also appreciate that 90s show didn't try to romanticize this coupling, as the joke of the scene that they're in together is their on-again, off-again romance, with Kelso noting that they were on their way to get remarried. In a way, this does kind of seem like a setback for both characters, as I think both Kelso and Jackie evolved a bit more as characters in the last couple seasons of the show. This show seems to dismiss that previous growth in favor of going back to a nostalgia act. But then again, I mean, we are talking about that 90s show, so it kinda is a nostalgia act any way you look at it. What I'm trying to articulate here is that Jackie and Kelso feel more like their characters from the first season of the show than they do their characters from the last season of the show. Although I will try to make an excuse for this here and say that sometimes when you're with the people closest to you, you have the tendency of reverting back to who you were when you met that person. Regardless, this is pretty noticeable if you're a fan of the show. I can understand the reasoning for pairing them together, and I don't hate it at all. It may be a bit of a downgrade in character development, but it is at least an upgrade in the entertainment department. So you win some, you lose some. Of course, Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher are always going to work better off each other than having her play opposite Wilmer Valderrama. Probably because Mila and Ashton are actually married. So if the chemistry ain't there may be a bigger problem. Though with the two of them having a child, it does make me wonder where Kelso's daughter Betsy is. Maybe the next season will answer that. The one major downside of this relationship is the awful light it paints the two in when Fez is brought into the fold, as he confesses to Kitty that Jackie had cheated on him with Michael shortly after the original series finale. It doesn't seem like they ever made up either, which is kinda sad to think about when thinking about our favorite 70s gang. Worst of all is that Fez remained heartbroken for the last 15 or 16 years, not feeling anything deep or meaningful until meeting Sherry, who we'll get into later. I think the way Fez's life panned out makes sense for the character. He began working with hair in the last seasons of the show, and he seemed pretty passionate about it. So this seems like a natural evolution of his character. With the last season of that 70s show making Fez a total ladies' man, I think his pursuit of Sherry and the way that he carries himself makes sense for the character. And out of all the original main cast members, Wilmer Valderrama's performance feels the most welcomed. He is the funniest returning regular turned reoccurring, and it legitimately feels like he, more than anyone else, had a story to tell. Donna's father and Eric's father-in-law, Bob, makes an appearance as well to celebrate his granddaughter's birthday. This might sound weird, but this was something I never really thought about before. The prospect of Donna and Eric getting married, then making Red and Bob family. I don't know why it never occurred to me, but it hadn't. And in practice, I think that that's a fun new layer to this friendship. Bob's always been a force of nature brought into Red's life through circumstances outside his control. First they were neighbors, and now they're in-laws and co-grandparents. Don Starks has barely slowed down, and he still brings the same oblivious, oafish energy to the role. There's just something infectious about this character's natural happy nature, and he was a much appreciated surprise. Another welcome surprise was the sudden re-emergence of Fenton in the season 1 finale. Fenton was one of the highlights of the later seasons of the show, showing up just as the show was about to hit its decline. The episodes that featured this character were always at least somewhat entertaining. So it was fun to see that after all these years, his feud with Fez is still ongoing, with the two still holding a hatred of each other over a pair of pants from a decade and a half ago. It's perfectly petty on both their parts, and even with the episode ending with the two calling a truce, I think there's a good chance we see them butt heads again as the show goes on. But if we don't, I think there's enough closure given to that story. The two are like this franchise's giant chicken fights. But unlike those giant chicken fights, they haven't overstayed their welcome quite yet. There's a lot about this show that I think is very interesting in concept and in premise, but I don't think it always hits the mark in execution. Turning into our parents is a very real thing. A lot of people do over time resort to what they were taught when they were younger, because ultimately that's your primary example of being a parent. But when Eric snaps and tells his daughter that he'd put his foot up her, just as his father before him has been known to say, it's not really played for laughs or for shock, so it just kind of sits in the middle ground in limbo. Not every moment lands, but still, plenty, if not most, do. The disconnect between Leia and Eric is very relatable, because I think almost everyone's had a point where they wanted to break away from their families a little bit more and become more independent. That's something timeless and universal. And to see it explored here as an introduction to the new characters and a farewell to the previous ones is actually one of the factors that I think works very, very well. We see how hard as a parent it could be to give your child free reign to the free world without them. And while Eric struggles with that, ultimately his love for his daughter trumps his fear of letting her go, so he allows her to spend the summer at Point Place with her grandparents. I'm gonna try to stop saying this word, but there's something really sweet about watching these two approach their later years, handing down their knowledge and advice to yet another generation of Point Place teens, becoming not just watchers, but mentors of sorts. Leo's occasional reappearances are right in line with the character, and Tommy Chong hasn't missed a beat. The show introduces him and brings him back at random intervals, just as the original series had. Sometimes providing some ironic assistance, and other times, just providing a punchline. Like how Kitty begins to rethink the circumstances in which she knows Leo. What with him being an older man who hung out with her teenage son. I think what makes Leo great is that you can plop him in anywhere, in almost any plot, without any context, and it will work more for the lack of context. For better or worse, there's a certain novelty of nostalgia that comes with seeing these characters all come back together. And the characters who couldn't be present are instead remembered as they're mentioned in passing. Lori gets a nameless name drop later on in the first season from her parents. Pastor Dave appears off screen in a certain section of a movie store. Hell, even Casey Kelso gets a mention. The one character that's very obviously completely absent is Hyde. It's an empty space that certainly feels strange, but it's completely understandable why it's unaddressed. With the real-life ordeal surrounding Hyde's actor, perhaps it's best to leave the character alone and silently retire him. It's unfortunate, but really, what else are you gonna do? But there are some moments that seem borderline bizarre without him. Like when Fez flashes back to his old Circle days and they're now Hyde hidden. It's really noticeable. And the fact that they haven't said anything in regards to his character is kinda a little off-putting from a continuity standpoint. Even if they said the character passed away or was in prison or something like that, I think that would be a satisfying enough reason without calling too much attention to the character's actual absence. But as it goes right now, there is no mention of Hyde. I know some people have theorized some things. I don't think that they hold any weight, because I think the show is currently going out of its way to not mention him, or have any mention of him. Again, I understand from a business standpoint, but it's times like these where I really wish that there was a separation of character and actor. If you don't want to bring the actor back, I think that you have more than enough valid reasons not to, but the character did exist, and it did have a pretty big part to play in the show. I don't think this fictional character should be punished for the man that played him.
That's just a classic no-win situation.
The sequel series recycles a lot of elements from the previous show, including plot points, story beats, and sometimes exact scenes. And while these references are appreciated, I don't think they ever hold up to what it is they're attempting to emulate. I absolutely hate what they did with the theme song. I understand that they were trying to put a 90s spin on that original song, but I don't really get that vibe from this. It just sounds like a really cover. Maybe that's in part due to how it's chopped up, but ultimately it comes off sounding more like the iCarly theme than it does the That 70s Show opening. And like the show that came before it, That 90s Show also isn't beyond the extended fantasy sequence that plays to whatever was current at the time. I have very mixed feelings about some of these scene transitions. Sometimes they feel like they're just sort of a lame holdover from the original series, but as time went on I started to find them a little bit more charming. which is kind of the same way I remember feeling about the original shots when I watched the first show as a kid. So if nothing else, it's on brand. Though I will still maintain I don't think all of them are great. Regardless, I don't want to make it seem like all these references or callbacks are unwelcome, because they're not. I think a good portion of time they're well done, and they reflect that not everything changes with the passage of time. The new gang seemingly reenact the season 1 episode The Keg in their pilot, when they find themselves with a keg, but now need to go on a mission to get a tap. They do go about things differently, and the outcome is also pretty different, but the story is mostly the same. Now, some people may look at that and think, wow, that's really lazy writing. They just rewrote an old episode of the old show. But I personally think it's pretty symbolic of the series itself overall. Doing the same things, but doing them differently. Having the same struggles, but having modernized solutions. I also like this because it shows that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Despite the change in decades and eras, teenagers are still teenagers, and they still have most of the same teenage problems. And when these references aren't put in place to make a point, they're just some good old light fan service to die-hard fans while not engulfing this whole experience and alienating new viewers. Like for example, when the group finds the original gang stash hidden in Candyland. If you're a new viewer, that's probably lost on you, but you're not missing a whole chunk of the story. That's something we've seen Eric do in the past, so it serves as a nice little reference that makes this plot more plausible. However, we also know that his parents knew about Candyland, so how that got by them is, well, that's a good question. There's a couple references that might slip by a couple people in passing, especially to those who are new. Off the top of my head, there's small things like the helmet from the original show being in the background, and even having the furniture from the living room back in the day now be the furniture in the basement.
I don't know what you heard, but this show ain't free.
What the hell?
I don't know what you heard, but this show ain't free.
No one's gonna look in here, because they don't have a dog anymore.
Oh, this has to go. We don't have a dog anymore. Michael Kelso would never have done that.
Michael Kelso glued himself to our refrigerator. I think you're setting the bar kind of low. Hey, wait. Don't you want your present?
My dad is giving me the Vista Cruiser.
A car? You got me a car?
It belonged to your father.
They're all given just enough context to both please an older audience, but not diminish the newer additions. Sometimes it's done just to hold up the tropes the series builds, which I guess is good for consistency. Things like keeping Fez's country of origin a secret, having Red threaten to stick his foot where the sun don't shine, or having the main cast go to the hub. Although, side note here, I noticed that the water tower says Michael and Jackie, which it did in the original show, but as of the season 8 finale, it should read Michael and Fez. So show, what I'm telling you is you did good, but you didn't do good enough. Overall, I think that the nostalgia plays heavily into the show without being too disruptive to everything new they have going on. So now that we covered the past, let's cover the present. If the present was in fact 1995.
Your parents can watch her.
Were you not here with me in the 70s? They are not the best watchers.
Now previously, I've spoke about the influence that 70s show had over its sequel series, That 90s Show. Today, I'd like to follow that up by talking about all the new stuff this blast from the past provides. What's great about the new cast is that you definitely see fragments of the original crew, but they don't feel like shameless duplicates. Nor does every character feel like a picture-perfect recreation of a character from the previous show. Leia could obviously be seen as the Eric of the series, what with her similar placement in the story, near-identical mannerisms, and of course, blood relation. But she also differs enough from her father to feel distinct. She has the goofy sense of humor and awkwardness of her father. I could very easily see Eric Foreman himself delivering some of her lines in the original series. And I think like her on-screen father before her, she gives a natural likability to the character that could in the wrong hands maybe come off as irredeemably goofy, or unreasonably nerdy. Yet despite this, she doesn't share any of the same interests of her parent. And if anything, is actually a little bit put off by her father's open nerdiness. She takes after her mother Donna in terms of hobbies and style. While she does feel a lot like Eric, she doesn't just feel like a gender-swapped version of him. The characters have the same blueprint, but completely different foundations. It's like meeting a stranger who just so happens to look like somebody you know. This creates a performance that's familiar, but not too familiar. Like, it's familiar, but also, I'm not acquainted. I think you could also infer that Gwen is Leia's Hyde. You know, the cooler, out there, rebellious product of the time's best friend to her lead. The one who influences their decisions and helps them break out of their shell more. Constantly challenging their friend to take more risks and live their lives. The buddy with sage advice that is actually just sort of making it up as they go along. I like that they went with the archetype but changed everything else to make this character its own. Gwen is reminiscent of Hyde, but not completely derivative. It's not a perfect match. You're not going to hear Gwen spew conspiracy theories about cars that run on water, or start wearing shades that she decides to never take off, despite the fact that she's mostly indoors. But her presence and place in the lead's life follows the formula. Now, it gets really tricky when trying to figure out who's Kelso. Because obviously, being that his son Jay is a part of the Point Place posse, you would obviously think that he's got this space covered. And in a lot of ways, he does. He sort of takes up the same role in the group. Like his father before him, he's the girl-crazy ladies' man. His stupidity never quite matches his dad's, but it at times does seem like he's actively trying. But in that same breath, you could also make the argument that Nate is actually the Michael Kelso of the group, being the over-the-top, gullible, good-hearted goof, who is typically the butt of his best friend's jokes. Much more than Michael's actual kid, he seems to really embody the same type of character of the original Kelso. I guess by extension, Nikki could be seen as this show's Jackie, being one half of the only established couple in the opening of the show, and dating someone who could be seen as the new Kelso of the series. Like Jackie, she bosses around her intellectually inferior boyfriend. Like Jackie, she's also good in school, but unlike Jackie, she's independent, motivated, and has a fondness for reading, which is pretty much the polar opposite of that original character. I guess that would make Oz the Fez of the group, but that's probably the most far off one, because Oz possesses a level of cynicism and wit that Fez in his heyday wouldn't even begin to comprehend. The characters were created not as carbon copies, but instead similar concepts that deviate away from the expectations set by the predecessors. The show uses this to its benefit as well, because it gives a returning audience some sort of expectation as to how these events are going to unfold, all based on track record, making it much more interesting when something in the formula is changed or characters make decisions or do something their creative counterparts would never do, which makes it that much more shocking. If you're going into this with the expectation, well, this character's like this character and that character wouldn't do this, you're gonna find yourself sorely disappointed, or at the very least, very shocked, because these characters aren't those characters. They may seem a little bit like those characters, but they are completely new characters on their own. The new cast is actually really, really good. I don't think they're fully fleshed out entirely, not even by the end of the first season, which is definitely a downside because I feel like at the end of the first season of that 70s show, that cast was 100% cemented. Whereas here, it feels like we weren't really given enough time with all of them to fully understand them. On the bright side, that does give us something to look forward to next season. The downside is, I want to know now. I think we're given just enough of an impression to have some sort of idea of who they are. I really like Leia Foreman. First off, name-wise alone, spot on. Eric is such a geek and open Star Wars fan that he would absolutely name his kid that. I hate to keep reusing the same phrase, but it feels very on brand for that character. Character-wise, I see traits and mannerisms from both parents in this performance. And because it's an amalgamation of two of the series' leads, it manages to both feel familiar and yet original in its own unique way. They cast the perfect actress for this part too, because I genuinely believe her as her parents' daughter. The actress feels natural in the part and even manages to legitimize the weirder lines that she delivers. I actually think that she's every bit as good as Topher Grace was as a series lead. She makes for a great protagonist. The fact that she doesn't have many friends and is sort of new in town allows the audience to become reintroduced to Wisconsin. It also gives the show a chance to tell a lot of different stories for the character, watching her go through a series of firsts. While mild-mannered, she still seems desperate to break out and grow up. And against her father's wishes, the Foremans give her that opportunity. But more so over, she's desperate to fit in and be liked. Having a group of friends is a new experience to her. So she's still learning basic human etiquette while acting as the proverbial fish out of water. She has all the qualities you'd hope to see in a main character, feeling more person than perfection. She's intelligent but uneducated about the world that surrounds her. She's kind-hearted, but she's not immune to occasional selfishness. Well-meaning, but prone to making mistakes as well. As far as I'm concerned, Leia Foreman is a legacy character done right, sharing some of the DNA of her precursor, but not being identical to the Forerunner. Best friend Gwen is hard to describe. The actress brings a lot of energy to the role, but sometimes it does feel misplaced. For the most part, I think she makes the character work, but holy crap, do they give this character the most cringe-inducing lines. In the earlier episodes, the parts seem to be a little bit more overacted, but by the time the final episode comes around, it feels much more toned down and fitting. I feel like the character began to grow on her a little bit more as time went on. Regardless, I can see why Gwen and Leia would be attracted to each other. Gwen has complete freedom to be herself and she embraces it. She has a fondness for all things unpopular and different. I can totally buy into a friendship manifesting between the two, even if I don't necessarily agree with the pace that it went at. I'm having a lot of the same problems with this as I had with How I Met Your Father. The friendships formed seem really rushed in an effort to just get to the point of the plot. It sort of robs the audience of seeing actual friendships form instead of just insisting upon them. An easy fix to this, of course, is just to have the characters be friends prior to the start of the show, so that there's a history that's unseen and you're just being dropped into the middle of the story. You know, the audience is witnessing an already established friendship where said meaning is already implied. But here, I guess that would be a little bit harder considering that the Foremans are written out to not live in Point Place. What I love the most is that because we're introduced to Gwen through Leia, we're sort of seeing the character from Leia's perspective. So the impression of the character is that Gwen is cool. She's the main character that Leia wishes she could be, but is happy enough to befriend. Only to have her brother Nate late in the season express that Gwen isn't popular in school. She's not cool. She's just cool to Leia. This friendship endears me more to both characters, and I think there's a good chemistry between the two actresses playing them. Gwen and her half-brother Nate have a very love-hate relationship. Well, you know, maybe not hate. Hate's a strong word. Maybe a love-dislike relationship. They love each other because they're family, but they don't necessarily always like each other. They constantly clash, and conflict between the two seems to occur at random. But their sibling rivalry doesn't come from a place of hatred, it's just severe bickering. The two aren't beyond hugging things out and having a heartfelt moment, but they're also just as likely to have learned nothing and just default to the situation pre-solution. Nate is of course the goofy one, the walking punchline for all his friends, exhibiting a level of stupidity that you would think only possible from a Kelso. He may be a good guy, but he's not a very smart guy. His relationship with girlfriend Nikki seems to be the focus of the character, shown to always go above and beyond for her because he knows that she's out of his league and he doesn't want to lose her. Something Nikki is seemingly aware of and uses to her advantage. Nikki is probably one of, if not the most underdeveloped character of the bunch, but she's performed very well. Shockingly well, as a matter of fact. Especially considering that this is this actress's big debut. She doesn't show it at all. She feels right at home. And I would even consider this to be one of the stronger performances out of the whole cast. As of right now, her main purpose in the show is to either boss around her boyfriend or act as the voice of reason. And I really hope we see further development of this character because again, I think there's a lot of potential with this particular one. Nate and Gwen's family lived next door to the Foremans in the old Pinciati home. At the end of that 70s show, Bob sold the home and moved to Florida to open up a bait shop, while Donna was moving elsewhere to college. Gwen and Nate's mother, Sherry, kinda takes over the role from Bob of wacky neighbor, but goes about it in a completely different manner. Much like Bob, she has no boundaries and comes and goes from the Foreman residence as she pleases. But her actual character feels much more inspired by an entirely different That 70s Show character. I completely understand Kitty wanting Sherry around because in a lot of ways, she probably reminds Kitty of her own daughter Lori, whose whereabouts in the show are currently unknown. Being that her original actress passed away a couple years ago, and the recast actress wasn't exactly thought fondly of, I think it's more than likely that we're not going to see a return of this particular character. And I think in a lot of ways, Sherry is supposed to be a surrogate Lori. That's not something that ever goes spoken, but being a fan of the original show and being a viewer of this new one, I think it would make sense given the circumstances. In a lot of ways, I kind of feel like the Sherry character is an insight as to what a future for Lori would have looked like, whether she be the actual inspiration for the character or not. Lending some credence to that theory is the fact that there's a running joke with Sherry often acting and reacting to Red as if he was her father. She certainly does feel like a foster daughter to the Foremans. She also pops in and out of the show in intervals, not dissimilar to how Lori did in the original series. And she's dating Fez, which Lori kinda sort of did in the original series. Outside of the comparison there is to be made there, I think Sherry is one of the most fun new additions to that time period franchise. Jay, Jackie and Kelso's son, seems to be a chip off the old block. Immediately making a pass at Leia within his first few minutes of screen time definitely does seem like a very Kelso move. While he probably has a much higher IQ than his father, he is nonetheless his father's son, at least initially. He's introduced as a straight-A student, but as time goes on they seem to incorporate more of his father's mannerisms into his performance. Namely his intellectual prowess or lack thereof. Though this aspect of the character mostly goes overshadowed by Nate doing very similar shtick. While he definitely is his father's son, he isn't always. And sometimes when the character tries to follow in his father's footsteps, it feels like a child wearing their parents' clothing. It's cute, but it doesn't quite fit. I've rewatched this season several times, and the most I could say about this character is that he's smooth, or at least he thinks he is. We're never really shown it in practice. Having Jay and Leia pursue each other seems to make the most sense, and almost seems inevitable with the romantic history between these two families. Jay's father Michael actually once cheated on his mother with Leia's Aunt Lori, and those two would later date, while Leia's mother Donna once dated Jay's uncle Casey following a breakup with her father Eric. Their will they won't they is needlessly complicated when it doesn't have to be, which is both fitting for an ongoing series and also fitting for young love. Immaturity, developing brains, and lack of relationship experience complicate love even at its most simplest. I like the two together. But because the season is so much shorter than in the original series, I think their whole story thus far once again feels a little bit rushed. I don't think there was enough time given to them. There wasn't enough memorable moments between the two to really endear the audience to them entirely. Hopefully that will be worked on in the next installment, as Season 2 has already been confirmed. Lastly, there's Oz. Oz is up there with Leia and Sherry for me, as being one of my favorite new contributions. He's so different from anyone in any of the That Blank shows, so I find him to be a breath of fresh air. Bringing judgmental sarcasm to this group of friends, being the most rational, but at times being just as irrational as the rest of them. Like with Leia, I think there's an authenticity that comes through with this actor in the part. It doesn't feel like he's playing a part because I just believe everything that he says. He and Leia are my favorite characters because they feel like real people. Oz is an endless sea of sarcasm and sass. I think the character's comedic stylings are right up my alley. I don't know if you noticed, but dry humor is sort of my thing. I hope we get to see more from this character in the second season, because he does seemingly go missing in parts. I think that's a problem when you're dealing with a bigger cast of people. Sometimes people fall out of favor. And I don't know that there were too many Oz stories or big Oz moments, but I know that the moments that he was included in, I enjoyed more for his inclusion. My one gripe with the character is, he does sort of feel like a little bit of an outsider to everyone else in the gang. He's kind of the one that sticks out like a sore thumb. I buy the rest of these people being friends, but not as much with Oz. I really hope that they develop that a little bit more in the future. The characters are very well cast. I buy into this group of teens finding each other and becoming friends. And in short time, I found myself actually invested in this new Water Tower meetup. My one complaint, which I kind of already made, is that they don't feel fully fleshed out. I don't think as of the first 10 episodes I can reasonably say for sure that I know any of them outside of Leia and maybe Gwen. For the most part, they're very undefined. They're certainly not as established as the characters were at the end of the first season of That 70s Show. But to be fair, this season had less than half that amount of time to both act as a goodbye to the past and a hello to the present. So, I have hopes for the future. Ultimately, it leaves more for an audience to look forward to, but it does feel a little bit uneven. The season itself feels like it ended prematurely. And sure, if I wanted to take that as a commentary on how Summers felt cut short as a kid, I would say that's beautiful and brilliant. But that's not the case. And as a consumer, it didn't really give me enough time to get to know the characters. It's like just as I started to get really invested, the show ended. And speaking of how it ended, I think the way they went about closing the first season might have been a mistake. The plot twist of Leia and Nate almost hooking up does feel a little out of left field, and completely without merit. The two barely shared any screen time of note. I think the two of them actually had the least interaction out of anybody in this group. And then suddenly, they're just about to risk it all. Leia is ready to lock lips with her friend's boyfriend, best friend's brother, and love interest's best friend. And Nate is ready to cheat on his girlfriend that he loves dearly with someone that he barely knows. I feel like this might have been an error. Not too dissimilar from the Hyde, Donna, Eric love triangle from the first season of the original show. But time will tell, as this is only the starting point of a story and not an actual story itself. Still, I can't help but feel like this was sequel bait, that as of right now feels entirely unjustified. Again, time will tell. We're not seeing a finished product, we're seeing the start of it. So, I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt. From an outside perspective, it looks like they got all the right puzzle pieces, and now it's just a matter of putting them together properly. Obviously, as this was the show's first season, adjustments will be made with time. It's still finding its footing, but I think it's off to a really good start. It's got enough of what made the original series work, and enough entertaining new attributes to reel in new viewers. There is, of course, a bunch of references to 90s pop culture that I noticed, including Oz being dressed up as the little girl from the Blind Melon music video in a montage to that song No Rain. My favorite Batman movie being referred to specifically by name. Listen, if you wanted to get me invested, that's all you just had to say those two words. Batman Forever, I'm there. They even have Home Alone reenactments. I'm here for all of it. So it definitely appeals to the nostalgic part of me. Like that 70s show, they don't rely too heavily on this aspect though, only calling enough attention to it to remind you what period this takes place in. They don't make the same mistake as that 80s show, where they treat the decade as if it's the star of the show. That 90s show feels true to the decade while not feeling tied down to it. On another note, the show does take some surprisingly pretty risky jokes, and it isn't afraid to just put it out there. I think more than anything else, the major thing that this show should be credited for is creating an authentic feeling sequel show. This feels like a believable follow-up to That 70s Show. The events of this series, as well as its mere existence, doesn't feel like a soulless cash grab. It feels like an actual extension of the story that we knew and loved. It's an organic follow-up that not only survives as a sequel, but makes its own identity and succeeds as its own thing. As of right now, I'm a very big fan of the show. I don't think the first season was perfect by any means, but I do think it was pretty good. It is infinitely better than the last season of That 70s Show. It's much more inspired than That 80s Show. While that's not a high bar, I think it's enough for me to see serious potential and promise in this series. I like it enough to want to see more.
That 90s Show's back, and it is not better than ever. As a matter of fact, I would argue that it's significantly worse. While I was a fan of the first season, I didn't think it always worked as well in execution as it did in concept. Regardless, it still had its moments and provided what I believed was a promising start to a show. Comparatively, this season is unfortunately underwhelming. Part 2 picks up right where Part 1 left off, which is actually a part of the problem. Considering that so much time has passed between seasons, not just here in the real world, but also in the fictional one that we're talking about as well, what with Season 1 ending with the season, and Season 2 starting with that same season the following year, it's strange to see these characters act like the events from that previous part are still pressing issues. When I was that age, summers felt like they were a lifetime apart. I would also imagine that Leia kept in touch with all of her friends during that time period, despite the distance. As a matter of fact, the show mentions that she has. So having the cliffhanger the show closed things off on play such a major factor here seems a little bit impractical. The first finale saw Leia and Jay break things off briefly, and almost ended with her kissing his best friend and her best friend's brother, Nate. Further complicating matters is the fact that Nate is also dating Leia's other friend, Nikki. So this is just all kinds of bad decisions. So when Leia returns to Point Place the next summer, hijinks ensues, and she accidentally confesses to this act on the radio, leading to a confrontation between the four that is all too quickly moved on from. While this moment is moved past in favor of the group remaining friends sans tension, it does inevitably lead to Nate breaking things off with Nikki, in front of their group of friends, during a smoke circle. That's just gotta be some kind of party foul. But this breakup is pretty confusing in practice. If the goal was to just stir up some drama, then it fails because it's too quick to return to the status quo. As opposed to allowing tension to boil up and dwell throughout this season, they just kind of wrap up all the loose ends in the first 2 episodes. Not to mention that despite the 2 being broken up, they continue to hook up after the fact. Now, if the goal was to follow the formula of the first show with Jackie and Kelso, well then it fails on that front as well. In the Parent series about most of these characters' parents, Jackie and Kelso broke up all the time. It was kind of their thing, but this was usually done for comedic effect. Other times it would be done to drive home a narrative and set up an episode story. Here, it just sort of happens. And since the 2 are quick to get back together despite not actually getting back together, it sort of undercuts any attempt of tension that the show might have been going for. And since it's so hard to try to dictate what it was they were trying to do, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say I don't think that they did it. Even though Nate and Nikki very evidently did. That 90s show feels like it's taking cues from that 70s show, but it's not understanding the context of these cues. Nate and Nikki are said to have an unhealthy relationship, but the show doesn't showcase that. It just mentions that they've been fighting a lot. This is That 90s Show, not That 90s Tell. You show your audience what it is you're trying to get them to invest in. You don't just mention it and assume that it was heard and felt. And that's not a problem that's exclusive to this specific relationship. A lot of this season seems to just happen off screen. Ozzie and his long-distance boyfriend break up in between shots. The other couples this season shows don't fare all that much better. Leia and Jay's relationship is fine, I guess. There just isn't really a whole lot going on with them this season. Their relationship gets very little development. Whereas the last season it felt like Leia was progressing as a person, it now feels like she's not really doing much of anything. I don't dislike the pairing, I just dislike that there's nothing the writers can think to do with them. Because these 2 could be a lot of fun. Their contrasting personalities work against each other, and despite their differences, they're not immune to playing into each other's immaturity. Leia is a hopeless romantic, and Jay Kelso is a hopeless idiot. So you can see how they find some common ground. Gwen this season starts dating an Abercrombie & Fitch model, named Cole, showing that sometimes opposites really do attract. But I don't know what else I could possibly say about them. They're different, but they date is pretty much the whole dynamic here. I wouldn't say that this was bad, but I can't say more than this was. Ozzie, once again, is the one left out. Not given a whole lot to do, not given any major plot points, and while I've stated that the character can be fun and funny, it can also be a little too over the top for its own good sometimes. On occasion taking away from moments as opposed to adding to them. This season they tried to give him an emotional moment, but it falls flat. There's little investment in this character because the show hasn't made him important. Add on to it that we're supposed to feel sorry for him for being broken up with by someone who never appears on camera. As per usual, Red and Kitty are the highlight of this show. They're still just as great as they've ever been, even when the show isn't always providing them the greatest material. I will admit, a lot of the time it seems like they're retreading old ground, which makes sense as we're talking about That 90s Show. Making moments with previously established moments is all well and good. Sometimes it's good to sequelize and follow up on the former. Like when Red has a heart attack after hearing that his granddaughter and her boyfriend are ready to take things to the next level. That's not entirely unlike when he had a heart attack after hearing that Lori married Fez in That 70s Show. See, now that makes sense. That's a pattern that's applicable to real life. Heart problems are usually lifelong and continual, not just a one and done. That's completely fair play and accurate to reality. But having Ozzie make Kitty think that there's cause for concern in her marriage, after having done a very similar story beat on That 70s Show multiple times, just feels like a been there, done that. Like I said, regardless of what it is that they're made to do, seeing these 2 work with each other again still makes my day. They are worth a watch even in the worst episode. That being said, there are some noticeable changes made to certain characters. Jay probably getting the most amount of growth. And I'm not just talking about his hair, as he's now actively attempting to be a better person. And you get the feeling that he's not all that bad of a guy. He's just an immature dude who didn't get it. And to be fair to him, he doesn't get most things. It also now feels like they're having the character otherwise go full Kelso. He's somehow gotten dumber since the first season, but it's actually made the character that much more endearing. This change creates a little bit more of a comparison between he and Leia, as the two now feel equally oblivious, but in different ways. In terms of that 70s show alum, there's a lot less Easter eggs for fans of the first. Deeply departed characters are mentioned in passing by name, which was nice to hear.
I'm her grandpa too. Midge swore to me.
In her high school days, my daughter Lori was also very social.
Small inclusions like this feel proper to the story itself, and also kind of reiterates that those actors are gone but not forgotten. I think it's a touching little tribute to acknowledge their contributions to the series. Leia's other grandfather Bob had a bit part in the first season, showing up for an episode, but this time around, he's brought back to play a reoccurring role, as he's moved into the house across the street from the Foremans. His inclusion, or more accurately, re-inclusion, is certainly a welcome one. It feels like his relationship with Red picks right back up where it left off, and they didn't skip a beat. The one major difference is that Bob now stands up for himself more. While this is a change, it doesn't feel like a forced one, like back in Season 8 when they tried something like this the first time around. This feels much more authentic. It's a slight and subtle change, but a purposeful one. And after looking into the matter, those behind the scenes specifically stated that they wanted to ground this character and make him more into a real person rather than a constant punchline. That's not to say that he's still not on occasion the butt of the joke, or the one making butt jokes. It just means additionally that now he could be serious and play into more storylines than he could previously. Seth Green comes back as an adult Mitch, who has somehow both changed a whole lot, but also stayed the same. He's still just as disgruntled as he ever was, if not more so, and he still has that same hatred and jealousy of Eric Foreman, lashing out upon hearing Leia's last name and going on a tangent about how her father stole her mother from him, which, if you're a fan of the original series, you know that's not the case. Mitch is now the easily agitated manager of a Hot Topic. It's not the future I would have foreseen for this character, but it feels like a very fitting one nonetheless. Leo, of course, makes his obligatory cameo at the end of an episode, somehow showing up to a party that he mistakes for his own retirement party. He eventually reveals that he's leaving his business up to his never-before-mentioned son, who we'll get into in just a moment. Strangely enough, actor Wayne Knight makes an appearance as Red's hospital roommate, Bruce. Now, Knight previously appeared in that 70s show, but he was acting as an angel showing Eric a world without him. But the most interesting return may just be Will Forte, who never appeared on screen on that 70s show, but acted as a writer and producer for the show. Knowing that after having read his name a million times in the closing credits, it was nice to actually see him make an appearance. He's without a doubt the most interesting new character the show introduces, but unfortunately, I get the feeling that he's a one and done. Will plays Kiefer, a spiritual scam artist who tricks Kitty into buying his bullshit. He's inevitably shown to be a coke-loving sleazebag who is just making it up as he goes along, while feigning enlightenment. So there are still some familiar faces, but there are some obvious ones missing. Eric is written off as having not taken the trip due to illness. Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis didn't return to their roles this season. It feels a little weird not seeing their characters despite Jay being a main character, but then I think back to that 70s show and I ask myself how often I saw Jackie or Kelso's parents. And once I got the answer for that, it felt a lot more justified. Jackie's father is really only seen in 3 episodes of the show, and all of those appearances take place in the first season. Jackie's mother appears for 4 episodes throughout the show, only being given attention for a short story arc that saw Brooke Shields play the part. Kelso's father only made 1 appearance, and once again that was in the first season, while Kelso's mother is never seen. So to be fair, these two could never show back up again, and honestly it's looking like they probably won't, and it'd still make just about as much sense as anything else. But what makes much less sense is the loss of Fez. Fez appeared on 3 occasions in the first season, and was sort of set up to play a bigger part in the show in the future. He acted as Sherry's boyfriend, and it was clear that this wasn't meant to be a fling, but instead a long-term thing. For whatever reason, now he's MIA, and he's never seen and never mentioned. And speaking of Sherry, her role has definitely been diminished. Appearing in 5 episodes of the original 10, she goes down to appearing in 3 episodes out of 8, and playing a far less important part of this show this time around, which is a real shame, because she was one of the more fun new additions of last season. The only thing of note she does here is Matt Rife, who is playing a germaphobe pilot for some reason. I'm not going to complain too much about this, because these are the types of background characters they would have set up in the last show. On the topic of the old gang, the only original to make a comeback in cameo form is Laura Prepon as Donna, and she's just really killing it. She doesn't have as much screen time this time around, but whatever time we have with her is usually time well spent. She's very supportive of her daughter, but she's also not a sucker. She's super involved in her kid's life, but stops short of being overbearing. Does she overstep sometimes? Sure, but no more than any other parent has, and a lot less than most parents of their decade did. While she supports her daughter's decisions and compliments her on coming to the right resolution, in this case choosing to not steal the tape in which Nate confesses to Nikki about their almost kiss, Donna commends her for her decision and still erases the tape on her behalf in order to protect her daughter. It's a little gesture that says a lot. That being said, every nod to the past isn't exactly well received. There are plenty of times where the show contradicts its own continuity. Red makes mention that Bob needs a haircut, but it's pretty well documented that Bob wears a toupee. Red also talks about marrying Kitty because they paid more in the army for family men, when Red actually met Kitty when he was already enrolled. There's some new inclusions in this new installment, with the season ending with Leo's son and his buddy showing up to Point Place, and having those characters be played by Kevin Smith and Jason Mewes, who are in their full Jay and Silent Bob getup, even though this show already made a point to mention Clerks and Kevin Smith by name in the first season.
I love Clerks. Kevin Smith, right?
Clerks, starring Kevin Smith. I'll take a slice of that.
It seems like a strange choice that was made in an effort to write Leo off and find a modern replacement. And you know what? That kinda checks out. I don't mean to overuse this word when talking about the show, but everything about it just feels inconsequential. Arcs begin and end in the same episode. Sometimes it feels like the story's introducing a new character who will have longevity in the series, but in most cases they're just one-off plot players. While the first season seemed to want to develop the characters a little more, this season decided that they were very comfortable with where they are, with almost nobody attached to the show having any kind of evolution as a character. This is gonna seem like a weird complaint, but I think it's a valid and somewhat distracting one. The jokes seem to happen at the expense of the moments themselves. Like, the comedy's trying to rear its head in places that it doesn't make sense, and in other places where jokes should happen naturally, it feels like they're incredibly forced for some reason. A lot of the time, Leia's daydreams go awry, like having Lisa Loeb interrupt Leia's remaking of her music video, or having Jay eat Doritos in the middle of her imagining them as Romeo and Juliet. The joke should be the fantasy itself, as opposed to trying to make bad jokes within that fantasy sequence. More accurately, the joke should be about Leia's idea of romance, considering that she has such little life experience. Not someone interrupting a scene from a famous movie to eat a chip. You miss the obvious joke in an effort to shoehorn in a bad one. And realistically, if these are her fantasies, you would think that they would go as planned. But hey, at least the laugh track seems to be having a good time, as it can't even catch its proverbial breath from how often it's played. That 70s show had a laugh track, and it was never nearly this distracting. I don't think it helps matters that the jokes are rapid fire, and more often than not, it feels like they're shooting blanks. They don't exactly land the punchline, and sometimes it's questionable what the punchline even was supposed to be to begin with. The acting is still hit or miss. And there's plenty of times where it hits, but when it misses by a large margin. Probably not helped by the fact that the actors have to take a pause after every sentence for imaginary laughter, but it wouldn't be award-winning had they not had to do that anyway. Some of the time it feels like Disney Channel acting, and that feels even more weird when it's juxtaposed with raunchy humor and sex jokes. The time period references are all over this show, and it gets excessive very quickly. Their only place on this show seems to be in an effort to remind the audience when this takes place. They could be fun some of the time, but most of the time they're not. And I think ultimately this series suffers from the same problem that 80s show suffered from, and that's not having the same substance as its predecessor. It wasn't the decade that made that first show so successful, it was the characters. Now I will say, to the season's credit, it did begin to grow on me more with each passing episode, but by the end of it, it's a pretty bad first half with an alright second, which I don't think is a passing grade. It still isn't exactly stellar. This season wasn't unbearable, but it was a lot less entertaining and enjoyable than the first one. I don't hate it, but I'm finding it hard to like it. Season 2 is tolerable, but it doesn't exactly make any kind of impression, good or bad. I'm actually currently working on a retrospective of That 70s Show, and it's taking me so long because of how often I have to pause to take notes. There's just so much to talk about it, and I'm only on the first season of that show. Now, in comparison, I watched this season 3 times in a row in order to find things to talk about. I really want to like this series. And sometimes I do, but it feels like a lot of its good qualities are lost in a seemingly endless sea of mediocrity. I don't want to see it end, as I think that there's some merit to it. I want to see someone flesh these characters out, accentuate the positives, and negate the negatives. It's not an impossible task. You have a talented cast, you have a good idea of who these characters are. Now if you could just let the audience in on it, you might have something here. That being said, I can't imagine if changes aren't made soon, that the show will make it past its already guaranteed 3rd season. And that was That 90s Show Part 2. Well, the time has finally come. That 90s Show is back for a 3rd season. Or a second half of its 2nd season. Honestly, it's hard to say based on the way Netflix is marketing these things. I mean, parts? Really? But having said that, Part 3 is by far the best part thus far. Which might in part be due to its director, as all 8 of these episodes were directed by original series original Laura Prepon. And I think that definitely helped matters. This is a much easier watch than Part 2, and it's a lot more entertaining than Part 1. It feels like the show is finally starting to stand on its own. It's surviving as its own unique thing. It hasn't forgotten about the past by any means, but it's not necessarily coasting off it. That 90s Show has been establishing its own identity apart from its parent, which is good because when making a follow-up to a famous show, you don't want it to be married to its predecessor. You want it to be related to it. Like a distant cousin, so to speak. But not so distant that you can marry it. You know what? The metaphor has eluded me. Let's just proceed.
I missed out on the whole thing, to be honest with you. I was confused by it. I was very confused by the whole thing, if I'm being honest.
The cast continue to get more comfortable as their characters. And any problems with previous performances are null and void. The cast seem to have perfected their parts. Each episode, it feels like they start to grow out of their blueprints more and more, feeling less like character types and more like actual characters. And it's not just the cast, because the comedy hits a lot better this time around as well. I mean, it's not laugh-out-loud hysterical like the sound effects desperately want you to believe it is, but it's funny enough in its own right.
I miss my old vacuum rat.
Do you know what might make you feel better? If we sang Happy Birthday to the Toaster.
We need to break up.
No.
I'm breaking up with you.
Right, and I said no.
I can tell when people have had sex. That guy over there just had sex in the parking lot.
With you?
Oh, you can do it too.
I don't want this to turn into some immature standoff.
It's not.
I'd rather die than get off this couch.
You sound like Clint Eastwood.
He sounds like me.
It's Judgment Day, bitches.
Just can't figure out how the heck this thing broke.
Just came off?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Can you do that?
Yes.
Yes, you'll break up with me.
Nope.
I'm actually kind of impressed with how this show is coming into its own, because Part 3 is already leagues ahead of what it was in Part 1. This time around, we see a lot of shoutouts to the show's titular decade, and I feel like these references feel less cheap than they have previously. Attention's put on the Beanie Baby craze, the wrestling scene which was booming at the time, and there's even a scene showing the family sitting around the living room watching America's Funniest Home Videos. And all of these things were a part of my own particular childhood. Much more important than these callbacks is the context of these callbacks, because the show isn't stopping short to make mention of all these ancient relics. They're brought up naturally, either in passing or because they play into the plot at hand, which I think is a lot better than in Season 1 when they had to stop everything they were doing to try to call attention to something from the time period. This time around they go all out. Leia even gets to have her own deeply bizarre fantasy of Doug Funny. I honestly could have lived without seeing that, and I honestly wish that I did. There's also a couple of callbacks to that original series, and while these cameos and Easter eggs aren't plentiful, they do feel a lot more meaningful. like how the show introduces Kelso's firstborn child and Jay's half-sister Betsy, who is one of my favorite new additions to this series. She is absolutely awful in the most awesome of ways. Much like her half-brother, I would say it seems like she's more of her father than she is her mother. She certainly has the prowess of her on-screen dad, but she's just a lot more manipulative, wrapping Nate around her finger and pitting him against her brother just because. To say that she's self-centered would actually be an understatement, as she makes it clear that she wants to be the center of everyone else's life as well. Betsy has an interesting sibling rivalry with her younger brother, and their banter leads to what might be one of my favorite interactions in the whole series, with the two mirroring the fanbase of the original show.
Dad stayed with my mom.
Not for those weird 3 years in the middle.
We don't talk about that!
There's also plenty of reoccurring returns. Fez's lifelong rival Fenton comes back, and he's still just as insufferable as ever. Sherry's former landlord is now working at a pawn shop, and proves to be a pain for Nikki, as her parents had pawned off her childhood guitar. Always the antagonist, Fenton ups his price when realizing the sentimental value it has to her, leading to Nate trading in his van in exchange for it. Fenton's a lot of fun here, but I think this character will always work best when played against Wilmer Valderrama, whose absence has still gone unannounced up until this point. He still works well in his own right as a reoccurring character, and I'm sure we'll see more of him in future installments. But without Fez, it feels like a part, and most importantly, the purpose of this character is completely missing. Mitch is back once again to put the moves on and creep out Donna, and he succeeds at the latter. I think Seth Green has become so over the top as this character that it makes his first performance in that original show feel tame in comparison, though that isn't a complaint. I actually think he matches the tone of this series perfectly, even if he dials his character down to being a caricature. He's still a lot of fun to watch. Mitch is now running a men's support group, which winds up being attended by Nate, Bob, Red, and most surprisingly, we even get an Earl Easter egg. For those of you who might not remember, Earl was a former coworker of Red's. He was a sad slacker that for a while became the bane of Red's existence, with him once even being nicknamed the New Eric. Earl is just as miserable as he ever was, though this time around he seems to have an affinity for fire, becoming a bit of a pyromaniac in between the decades. Bob's ex-wife Midge is mentioned, with Bob finding her belongings and having a bit of a breakdown, making it clear that much like her actress, Tanya Roberts, she's no longer with us. It's sad watching Bob get caught up in a past that he can never relive, but the story ends on a high note, with him learning to look back at it with fondness. Similarly, Laurie is also brought up in passing, with her presence feeling past tense. Also, much like her dearly departed actress as well. Or at least one of them. I don't think we'll ever fully get clarity on those situations, but it's easy to understand the sentiment. I think this finds a really nice balance of paying homage to the past while using that past to pave the way for the present. I really appreciate that this series is taking older characters and doing new things with them. It's fun watching Red and Kitty trying to adapt to the decade, feeling like fish out of water in most cases, but still sometimes finding their footing. I personally loved watching the two get drunk together while being scolded like they were children by their daughter-in-law. Deborah Jo Rupp and Kurtwood Smith are always a highlight of this show, and they make even the worst episodes feel like they're worth watching. Donna takes on a much more motherly role in the background, and I'm not just talking about for her own child and her child's friends. She also has to parent her in-laws on several occasions as well, to hilarious results. In addition to a few familiar faces, there are also some brand new ones. Cedric Yarbo of Reno 911 fame plays Sherry's ex and Gwen's father, Otis, putting a rest to the long-running rumor that Hyde was in fact Gwen's father. And quite frankly, with the way that situation has gone, probably for the best to nip that fan theory in the bud. Otis is a well-meaning, carefree, and absent-minded guy. He's somewhat neglectful of his daughter, but that's not entirely intentional. Instead, he's written off as being an innocent buffoon, and because of all this, he comes off as the perfect partner for Sherry, and makes you wonder how these two crazy kids couldn't have worked things out, because they are a perfectly imperfect pairing. It's actually kinda refreshing to see that there's still a romance and, more importantly, a healthy relationship between the two. Very often in sitcoms, exes are depicted as enemies, and these two are anything but. Leo's son Sonny and his best bud Bunch finally play into the show a bit. While I enjoy their place in the series, I can't say that I love Kevin Smith's over-the-top hammy acting. It's a little bit much, and it really makes me yearn for the days when he didn't talk. Having said that, it's definitely interesting seeing a toned-down Jay and Silent Bob. I do think in short intervals they make for solid additions to the story, but at times this season it feels like they're a bit overexposed. Maybe because they're the new toys for writers to play with. I don't love them, but I don't necessarily hate them either. But I can say without a shadow of a doubt, this is not my favorite use of Jay and Silent Bob in a TV show. Sorry, that goes to Degrassi. The Miz has a somewhat fun, if not somewhat forgettable cameo as wrestling superstar The Party Animal, and I don't think that they did quite enough with this character. Miz's particular acting style feels perfectly in place for a show like this, so I really hope that they get better use of him in the future, assuming that they do in fact use him again in the future. Sherry Cola plays a coffee shop owner who asks for Red's aid in scaring away annoying customers, which winds up working a little bit too well, leading to her losing sales. I don't know how many of these characters will make a comeback in the future, but that seems to be part of the fun. I think that there's more than enough wiggle room to evolve these background players and have them play bigger roles later on. But it's also fine if they wind up just being one-off characters that serve the purpose of that particular plot. This season sees a lot of new developments for the new Point Place gang, especially in terms of their love lives, which seems to take center stage. Like for one, Leia and Jay actually seem to have a love life, as they decide to take their relationship to the next level, to the disgust of everyone around them. Now, a lot of the time when showrunners are writing couples, it comes down mostly to the chase rather than showcasing the actual relationship, which is mainly because, dramatically speaking, it's a lot more compelling watching the moments leading to a relationship rather than seeing the relationship blossom itself. When writers finally pair two characters together, typically they start trying to briefly take them apart, because there's more entertaining arcs and developments to explore when a character is stuck in the in-between. Writing couples can get boring, but to this show's credit, for the most part, Jay and Leia don't have a lot of these issues between them, and most of, if not all of their tiffs, wind up feeling short-lived and really forced for that time being. I can't emphasize this enough. Anytime these two are arguing, it takes me out of the whole show by just how illegitimate it feels. But that's fine, because even if there's not a lot of drama or tension between the two, it doesn't mean that they're not entertaining in their own right. They make for a cute couple, and their interactions are very wholesome in a young, dumb, and cringeworthy way. I think out of all the pairings this series has had to offer, at least in terms of the younger cast, they are by far the best. It didn't feel like they had much in common in the first season, but now it's become hard to imagine them apart. Though with the way this season closes off, that might be an inevitability. Speaking of couples calling things off, previously Nikki and Nate had split up and chosen to go their separate ways. In this half of the season, both parties find other significant others. Nikki winds up dating a theater kid named Theo, and Nate winds up seeing Betsy, to the chagrin of her brother / his best friend, Jay. While both relationships seem to look promising at first, they quickly fizzle out, and ultimately the couple get back together by the end of the season, in a really heartfelt and endearing way. Even Oz gets a boyfriend this time around. And sure, his love interest isn't all that interesting. Look, I know I just used that phrase before in another video, but the shoe still fits. At least they're trying to do something with this character. I think their brief time together is kinda wholesome, but there's not a whole lot of chemistry between the two. One of them doesn't even really feel like a character yet, which is a problem I find with a lot of the short-term romances that a lot of the gang find themselves in. Most pairings outside of the main cast don't make much of an impression. These two remind me of Gwen and her last boyfriend, whose name I can't even remember. On the subject of Gwen, she's now left as the odd man out. She has no story arc and no direction whatsoever, which is a little disappointing, because I think her actress has gotten a lot better in the role since the first season. It's not just that she doesn't have a partner, she doesn't have a purpose or plot for 7 out of 8 of these episodes. I feel like given the structure of the show and the amount of stars on it, someone is always going to be left out. Now typically in the first show, it was usually Fez. But this time around, it seems like the cast is playing a game of musical chairs in terms of relevance. This has been a major improvement. And while I look forward to seeing where the show is headed, admittedly, there are some things I'm still not really loving. Like the laugh track can be a little much a lot of the time, and the background audio outside of that can be lacking most of the time. Like when they're out at a bar, the music is nearly muted when they're all supposed to be dancing to it. The green screens are beyond blatant, though those are always harder to work with when you're using elements like smoke. There's a couple things that also confuse me creatively speaking. Like the last part ends with Jay and Not So Silent Bob crashing through the kitchen wall, and this part starts with the gang desperately trying to fix things before the Foremans get back home. When they do inevitably find the hole in the wall, the kids act like it was their doing, except it wasn't. I get that this happened at one of their parties, but that really could have been stricken from the record altogether. They're not the ones who drove a car through the kitchen, so them taking the fall for it really makes no sense whatsoever. Despite all of this, like I said at the beginning of the video, without question, Part 3 has been the best part so far. The cast seem to be shedding their Disney Channel Nickelodeon style of acting in favor of something much closer to the original series that they're trying to emulate. And the show itself is no longer surviving off nostalgia. Well, I guess technically it still is, just nostalgia for the decade it's based in and not nostalgia for the cast who worked on the original show in the decade that it's based in. As opposed to focusing primarily on the past, it's putting focus on its future. And it's doing a good job of that to its credit. The characters are more fleshed out and just overall more fun. The situations and stories they find themselves in are more entertaining, and I'm finally at the point where I actually care about the new Point Place posse. I really hope the show continues at this quality of creative. If they can do this consistently, they really have something good here. Is it better than that 70s show? No, of course not. But it's good as its own thing. I don't think the show should be viewed as the successor to that 70s show, but instead its somewhat successful offspring. And I, for one, am a fan of this family. With that being said, if you like this video and want to see me cover future installments in the franchise, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
Think 90s.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.